Most painters work on a flat canvas, but not Alexa Meade.
I paint on people and three-dimensional objects. I do it in a way that will make them look like a two-dimensional painting when photographed. Looking at my work, it feels ambiguous about where things lie in space, and it's hard to wrap your head around the dimensionality of it, especially when you're just looking at a two-dimensional image. In video, you can start to see some of the depth cues of parallax and the movement of the camera revealing more angles of the painting.
Meade calls her work reverse trompe-l'œil because instead of painting on a two-dimensional surface to trick the eye and brain into seeing a three-dimensional object, she's flattening three dimensions into two.
This isn't forced perspective. It works from every possible angle that you could approach it. I paint on the back sides of things. I paint on the underside of tables. Every surface within a scene will be covered in a mask of paint, and this mask of paint will reference what's directly below it. It'll exaggerate it or accentuate some minor details or flaws that will give it that painterly edge and really change the way that you would perceive depth within the scene.
Interestingly, Meade never intended to become an artist.
I didn't know that I'd end up being a painter. I'd studied politics, and that was my life path and my dream.
Meade's work has been exhibited around the world, including at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. She's worked on advertising campaigns for Mercedes-Benz, Ralph Lauren, and LaCroix watches. And yes, those are her brushstrokes on pop singer Ariana Grande.
I painted Ariana Grande for her God is a Woman music video. That was inspired by a collaboration I had done with Sheila Vand, where I painted Sheila's body, put her in a pool of milk, and the colors dissolved off into patterns all around her. For Ariana Grande, I did a similar process where I painted her and put her in a giant pool of liquid paint.
But Meade is best known for her dimension-collapsing style of painting figures and scenes.
When I'm painting, I'm capturing a mapping of light. I paint in the shadows, I paint in the highlights, and I exaggerate them. I make the darks darker and the lights lighter, which is quite counterintuitive. A lot of people think that if I'm going to be flattening space, that must mean that I am neutralizing the shadows, that I'm perhaps painting the shadows lighter to match with the rest of the environment. And in fact, I'm just doing the opposite. By pushing them so far apart, it makes it harder for your eye to see where the natural shadows and contours are. And instead, you just see my painted brushstroke representation of the shadow. I have to really follow the contours of the object. And when it comes to clothing and the drapery, I have to be really careful that my brush doesn't disturb the drapery. If I'm painting it on a mannequin, I need to be sure that my brush doesn't dent a peak in the clothing and then create a new area of shadow. The way I apply paint depends on the aesthetic I'm going for. Oftentimes I'll dip my brush into multiple colors and then just do these big strokes that combine the brushstroke hair texture of all of these different colored striations going through it. If I'm doing something in a street art style, it'll often just be straight white and straight black together in super high contrast. I'll use brushes that you would normally see artists painting with. I'll also use giant brooms. If I'm painting a wall that's 36 feet wide and I have to make it look like an impressionist painting, I can't be using a brush that wide. I need to have something that's on an 8-foot handle and just sweeping it onto the walls. The illusion is most effective when I am painting things that have extreme depth to them. The more 3D an object is, the more startling the collapse of space appears. Whereas if I'm painting something that has shallow depth and I try to flatten it, you see that little bit of depth and it's not as convincing. It's almost paradoxical that to really flatten something, I have to start with something that has extreme volume.
Human bodies have a lot of volume to work with.
I use different paints on the skin than I use for everything else. There's usually very little surface area of the body that I'm physically painting on. It's usually just the face and the hands. And in that case, I am always using on the body a special paint that is safe for the skin.
But learning how to apply paint to a person to make it look like a painting of a person took a lot of trial and error.
Earlier in my career, as I was developing this style, I wanted to see how lifelike I could make the paintings. Sometimes if I paint a subject too smoothly and too close to reality, there's an uncanny valley effect, where it just looks like a human who's wearing too much makeup rather than a painted portrait.
Her work can at times seem like a Banksy-style street art come to life, or an impressionist portrait made real. But that's because it's a collaboration with her models.
When a painter is painting on canvas. They're capturing one particular expression of the model, or in cubism, perhaps multiple expressions at once. But it's a single image, and it's largely decided by the artist how that person will be portrayed. In my work, I'm painting physically on the person. And so even though it might be my decision where I'm putting down the brushstrokes and the color palette, the human still shines through. And in the photography, there's micro expressions, there's the look in the eyes. And something that's really fun about that is that people are dynamic, and you can capture interesting things on video that you might not ordinarily be able to capture with a two-dimensional painting. One of my favorite paintings was of a friend of mine from high school who proposed to his girlfriend as living street art. And that was a real proposal. She had no idea it was coming, and I'm really glad she said yes. The painting was done in a black and white street art style, and the two of them walking down through an alley in San Francisco among all the street art blended in perfectly.
Amazingly, it was a class project that kicked off Meade's artistic career.
It wasn't until the end of my senior year of college, when I was about to graduate with my degree in political science, that I developed this technique for painting on shadows. And I realized there's something here, I have to follow it. And I kept pushing it until finally I was able to make a three-dimensional space appear two-dimensional. Before that, I hadn't seriously done any painting. I had never taken a photography course. And I had to teach myself these skills through the process of developing the illusion. When I did my first experiments with painting shadows on people, I didn't quite understand what's going on. Because when I photographed it, my friend looked like he was a two-dimensional painting. I thought any camera I was pointing at it was broken because it made no sense. My friend was three-dimensional in front of me, but on the screen it looked like it was a work of art. And I decided, I don't know what this is, but I have to play with it and see what happens and do more and develop it. I remember showing my professor the photos of my painted friend, and he completely didn't get it. And he told me that this looks like you could have made it in Photoshop, and if that's the case, maybe you should have just made it in Photoshop. He thought it seemed like a lot of extra work to physically paint on a person when I could get a similar effect doing something easier. And I tried explaining to my professor that that wasn't the point. This is about painting light and shadow and capturing it within this space. And I decided that I didn't really care what he thought. I needed to see for myself.
Since then, she's pushed her technique, developing ways to cover entire three-dimensional objects, even rooms, so that they appear to be flattened paintings from any angle.
I'm interested in playing with perception, creating something that looks one way, but in reality is something completely different. Finding different layers to peel back and look through.
Meade's most recent work is a project as one of Google's artists in residence. She's painting an installation scene and props for the tech company's Los Angeles offices, and later to be explored in augmented reality.
I'm working with Google to capture my artwork using light field technology so that the 3D nature of it in real life can then be preserved digitally as well.
The capture can later be turned into an immersive, augmented reality experience. But it wouldn't be a Meade piece without another layer or two. First, the installation was digitally mapped using Google's Deep View method.
We captured it with light field, and then we looked at what the digital depth maps look like of that space.
Different depths are represented computationally in different colors. It's what's known as a depth map.
I'm then taking that digital depth map from the light field and painting it directly on top of the space. And then we're going to be capturing that again with light field. It's quite meta. It's going from the physical 3D to the computational photography's interpretation of the 3D, painting that back onto reality, and then capturing it once more. Something that's been surprising me is that no matter what type of style I paint in, the effect will still appear to be a two-dimensional painting. It's not reserved for impressionistic style. It also works in a street art style, pop art style. And now in this project, I'm using a digital imaging style of the classic depth map to turn it not into a painting, but into something that looks like a two-dimensional computer graphic.
And of course, there will be a painted figure in the scene as well. That's where Meade finds her work resonates most with viewers.
There's aspects of the final image that I'm able to influence, but not necessarily able to control. And that has to do with how the model is holding themselves in front of the camera. That could do with the micro expressions, the tension in the face, the look in the eyes. And so much of that has to come forth through the model. It's almost like a collaboration because it's both parties coming together to create this look.
In the future, Meade is hoping to push her work with other collaborations.
I'm interested in collaborating with more scientists, engineers, mathematicians, people working in these different fields to create artwork together.